Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Long Game Podcast with myself, Ben Scallon, and my esteemed colleague, Jason Osborne. Jason, the presidential race is heating up. We have front runners like Mairead McGuinness announcing that they will not be running now for health reasons. We have, people stepping up to the plate, like this new Gareth Sheridan lad, the businessman who's entered the fray. And amid all of this turmoil and political theater, we now have a tragic blow to COVID fanatics everywhere. In that former chief medical officer Tony Holohan will no longer be running for the Irish. He had floated the idea. He said that he saw some very encouraging polls. He was gearing up for a campaign to sweep to power in the highest office in the land, and he has now withdrawn his hat from the ring. What do you think of that?
I think that the stage is being set for a political mastermind, Simon Harris. While his popularity is at an all-time high, to announce his entry to entry to the race. But no, I was distraught as well. Although, as someone pointed out, as despite his stated reasons that we'll be getting into, they suspect more so behind it was the fact that it would have been a step down to become the president from his former role as High King of Ireland while he was leading NEFIT in terms of the governance of the country. So no doubt it became an unappealing prospect to him upon reflection. But in all seriousness, I read that and I was like, who cares ultimately? I'm finding the presidential race so far in its fairly early stages to be an utterly unappealing and lackluster thing. And obviously, on the podcast, people come to it for our opinions, so I don't mind saying that as it stands at the moment, there's no one that I personally find particularly appealing has put themselves forward, and Tony Holohan dropping out is, in fact, one less unappealing personage putting themselves forward for it. So nothing nothing lost, I'd put it that way, from my perspective, and I would imagine probably for most Gript readers.
I was intrigued by his reason for dropping out. I mean, dropping out is even probably putting it too strongly. He never ran in the first place. He was just talking about the idea of it. But
That's true.
he withdrew his name from consideration because he said that he was afraid of personal attacks and the fact that he would be gone after in a way that was very hostile and nasty, and that his family would be dragged into it. And he went on this kind of screed about how there is a toxicity and a hostility to public debate now in politics. And Leo Varadkar, when he was stepping down, his last speech in the Dáil as Taoiseach, he said something very similar. And we've heard other leaders like Micheál Martin and all these different senior political figureheads saying that, politics has gotten very nasty now. Do you agree with Tony that it would have gotten nasty? And do you think that that's a good reason to not run for political office because it's going to get nasty?
I mean, I there's a lot to this. It's like, yes, it's gotten nasty, but it's also gotten nasty because people are really hard pressed, and a lot of that is as a result of horrendous political management of the country over the past couple of years. I mean, it's really puzzling to me when, say someone like Tony Holohan, who was, for all intents and purposes, I know he wasn't the one signing the legislation and quite literally making the decisions. It's just he became extraordinarily influential during the pandemic. It's bizarre to me that he would be puzzled that there might be very strong and yeah, I would say a lot of it probably would be toxic, and that I'm sure there would have been threats against him and his family and things like that. And obviously that
which we both agree is totally unacceptable
exactly
and not be done by anybody.
100%. It's just puzzling that, on a national platform, whether it be in Ireland or any other country, that sort of stuff is unfortunately going to be par for the course. I think much more reasonable would be that people would have, as indeed many of our readers probably have, extremely strong opposition to someone who is perceived as having done a lot to damage the country over those really intense years, deciding that, now is time to swan into a 7-year long term with potential for another 7 years, and receive a handsome sum for doing so, and a lot of lauds and praise, as was the case for Michael D. Higgins. So I think I don't know if he wasn't aware of this at the outset, and sort of the reaction to his announcement that he was considering running for president brought the reaction out of the woodwork. But if he wasn't aware of this, it's just another piece of evidence and direction of the thesis that a lot of these people are living on another planet in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit delusional, I feel, for him to think that that would not be. I mean, like, if I was to run for office, I would factor in the fact that there was going to be backlash. Anytime I make a TV appearance, I factor in the fact that there's going to be a lot of people saying nasty stuff on social media, as does the Taoiseach, as does the Taoiseach. Not that I'm comparing myself to them in terms of importance. I'm just saying, like, if you're a person in public life, you can very safely and reasonably assume and infer that there is going to be a significant cohort of people who are saying nasty things to you on social media.
Yeah.
That's not to say that's acceptable or that we should be happy about that, but it is to just not be naive and to understand that this is part of it. And also, when it comes to where that vitriol and where that anger comes from, I don't justify or seek to support people saying horrible things to politicians. I'd like it that if we lived in a society where people spoke to each other with decorum and respect. There's all this, you can see how I interact with politicians because I interact with them publicly on a weekly basis. I'm never disrespectful. I'm never rude. I'm never belligerent. And I think that that's the correct way to conduct oneself. But I also think that a lot of the frustration comes from people feeling like their leaders hold them in contempt, first of all, don't listen to them, don't care what they have to say, and in fact, actually dislike them. I think a lot of people feel like their politicians are riding roughshod over them to such an extent that they actually feel like the animosity is coming from the politicians. So it's less of an FU and it's more of an FU too. Well, if you,
Yeah.
so you hate me and my values and what I stand for, well then, and then they kind of want to return to sender. But so far as much of the public is concerned, it's the politicians are the ones who drew first blood. They're not
Well,
just coming out of nowhere. And then the politicians are kind of oblivious to this sentiment and they're kind of saying, what? People are, why is everybody so angry and upset with me?
when do people get so nasty?
Exactly, yeah. So far as there were maybe 10 things that led up to that you did that the public hated, and they told you that they hated it. And then after the 11th thing, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and somebody told you to go die in a ditch, and suddenly you're shocked and horrified. I think there's
Yeah.
that's not to justify it or say it's okay. It's simply to explain the dynamic that's going on, which I think a lot of politicians don't quite grasp.
No, that's exactly right, and we always reiterate things, and at the risk of boring our audience, it's like it kind of does need to be said because a lot of people do think it's okay. They say, oh, they're ruining the country, so it's fair game to say target, with abuse, say this person, and attempt to stop them from, I don't know, winning on the basis of that. That's obviously not good. As I say, his justification for deciding not to run was that he couldn't expose his family to distress, criticism, or abuse at a time when they're all still rebuilding their lives. And I obviously understand that sentiment that Mr. Holohan has, but at the same time, yeah, I think they constantly underestimate the level of anger that's out there. And it's funny how much this ties to the next topic we're going to talk about. A lot of this comes precisely from the fact that people don't feel like they're ever listened to. And so the next thing we're going to be discussing is concrete evidence of the fact that people aren't listened to. And, when that happens, again, this isn't justifying, but it's like, what do you expect? But for hard pressed people to, in the first place, start saying much more vicious and nasty things towards you and the other people who are in charge. And then in the second instance, like take, for example, people committing arson around iPass senders and suspected iPass senders and things like this. That's the next step up that ladder when they feel like, to use it, that their communities haven't been insulted or haven't been consulted, I would say, and other things like that they decide they're going to take actions into their own hands. So it's just it is this toxic loop, and the way it's always covered is that it's you nasty people, the public, who are saying these terrible things to people who put themselves forward to do the noble work of public office. And the reality is that sometimes the work of public office isn't noble. Unfortunately, in Ireland, it's sort of increasingly not noble, and a lot of people would are more than happy to point that out. And when it's not listened to, all people can really do in response is sort of scream and rage. And I do feel like this is picking up. Like, a lot of the politicians, and this is really interesting, a lot of the politicians in Ireland are unique, it seems to me, in turning off their comments on social media. Like, you look at like Keir Starmer, you look at pretty much any American politician, they'll get dogs of views in the comments as well, but they'll leave the comments open. Whereas here they'll turn off the comments. And it just seems like that's the constant tactic in Ireland. It's shut down opportunities for the public to give their feedback. When the public does give their feedback, ignore it and proceed to do what you're doing anyway, and then be astonished by the fact that there's backlash. So it's a really toxic loop. And yeah, despite how it's portrayed by media and politicians, it isn't just nasty, nasty people out there doing it. It is a two-way street. And terribly, there's absolutely no indication that anyone in office is waking up to that fact.
Yeah, like, I mean, we're taking the COVID era specifically. I mean, before we even get to the cervical check scandal and all of
Yeah.
that stuff, like, we don't even need to get into that. Let's just look at COVID and the fact that we now, in hindsight, I mean, many of us, you, myself, and many of our viewers knew that this was nonsense and preposterous farce at the time. But I mean, now the entire country, I think, whether they'll admit it or not, has probably realized that in retrospect, so many of the COVID measures were utterly moronic, useless wastes of time, such as the €9 substantial meal. How many of us remember that? That was supposed to stop you from getting a virus if you go into a pub. If you spend €8, that's not sufficient. If you spend €7, that's not sufficient. But
There's these
€9.
absolutely mad utterances like COVID loves to party.
Yeah, exactly. COVID loves a very scientific statement, that, or the
Yeah.
2 meter social distancing rule, which has no scientific basis to it whatsoever. That was literally just pulled out of somebody's ass. So many different things like this: masking outdoors, masking children outdoors. All of this. So having to take 27 different boosters per year to just be at like normal levels, the fact that all of this. So that was all ridiculous nonsense. No one has ever been held to account for that ridiculous nonsense, for inflicting that on the entire country for years. Tony Holohan was in a senior decision-making position at that time. And we keep having the can kicked down the road when it comes to a COVID inquiry. Many countries finished their COVID inquiry years ago. Britain, Sweden, their COVID inquiry is done and dusted, and it was very adversarial, and they asked the tough questions and they wrapped it up and it's finished. We haven't even begun ours, and whenever we do get ours, Micheál Martin has reminded us that it's going to be an evaluation. It'll be a nice, soft, easy question and answer session where they don't try to point the finger and nobody's to blame and we all did our best and so on and so forth. And none of the stupid decisions that were made will be essentially brought to light or exposed in any kind of meaningful way. So I'm not saying Tony Holohan was responsible for every single one of those bad policies, but he was certainly in a major position of influence during that time. And his direction of pushing the acts of the government was towards more nonsense. And he has never and will probably never be asked to account for any of that. And there's a lot of people who are still very upset about that. So again, I'm not saying people should be abusive to him on that basis. Absolutely not. But it is to say that you can't run around behaving like that and then be surprised that there's a significant amount of animosity out there,
Well,
or have that be a shock to you when you decide you're going to run for a major political office.
No, you're right, and to keep it focused on COVID, I mean, yeah, we, in our wisdom, decided that we're not going to have an inquiry, and no wonder why that's the case. Because I wrote last week about what we do have is the independent COVID-19 evaluation, and evaluation is a very friendly word, so they decided to go with that. And there was an update on its work. It started back in March or April, I can't remember quite which. And there's a number of different things they're doing, among which was a public consultation. And they gave an update on their work in July, and it was an extremely limited bit of feedback, but even that was really negative. And I'll just cite a little bit of it here, where they said high levels of negative impacts are emerging in preliminary findings across education and development, civil liberties, human rights and trust, and mental health. Those who reported difficulty in making ends meet reported considerably wider negative impacts across many dimensions. Early findings also suggest mental health strains overall were most concerned with issues such as COVID-19 exposure and loneliness or isolation. It also highlights education and social development as a significant issue for parents and guardians. To skip ahead to say where Tony Holohan might be directly implicated, the independent team did have the power to get documents from the state, and they received approximately to this point 500 documents from 18 government departments and the HSE, and they're currently going through all of those documents. And they said in their evaluation of what they've read so far that they reveal the overriding imperative of public health considerations and the level of influence that NPHET advice had on government decisions and measures introduced. So, like, they really didn't give away very much, but what they did give away was overwhelmingly negative. And say it says like how did they phrase it? The level of influence that NPHET had. Like, Tony Holohan was the face of public health advice for the course of the pandemic. As I believe David Quinn wrote about in the Independent over the weekend, that was kind of the last best chance to have some sort of adversarial conversation about COVID in Ireland's public square, a potential Tony Holohan run for the presidency. He's pulled out now, and that's never going to happen. So, he need not be surprised, I suppose, that he's something of a lightning rod for all of the hurt people feel over the damage and loss experienced during that time. Because, yeah, based on what the evaluation is finding at the moment, there's a lot of it, way more than way more than whatever positives might have come out of the pandemic. And yeah, so there you have it. No surprise.
I mean, I remember you alluded to this already, but in the UK, there was a report that found that many young children were exhibiting almost, it was a while since I read this article, so I'm kind of paraphrasing. And so if I fudge some of the details, then, sue me. But this is more or less what it said, that effectively young children were expressing almost autism-like symptoms
Yeah,
because they had not seen human faces and emotions from such a young age because of all the masks that were around them. That obviously children become socialized by learning facial expressions and seeing your people laughing and smiling or frowning or whatever, and that they weren't getting that. And so they were exhibiting weird social behaviors in their like toddler years and that kind of thing. All of that. There are people who weren't able to graduate. I almost wasn't able to have my wedding. This is something that I even forget about. That this was, there was a serious question over whether or not my wife and I were going to be able to hold our wedding, because it was open and then it was closed and then there was a lockdown and then there was no lockdown and it was here, there, and everywhere. And so you put all this money into the venue and then you're like, is this even going to be possible? So yeah, anyway, the point is that's something that we have never really seen a reckoning for, and we probably should in some sort of tribunal.
You're exactly right. I mean, the bottom line with all of this is there was real damage done. It really affected a lot of people, as was outlined in that limited feedback that the evaluation gave. Those who reported difficulty in making ends meet reported considerably wider negative impacts. You know who didn't have difficulty making ends meet during the pandemic? Tony Holohan, or any of the Stephen Donnelly, who was the Minister for Health. Well, Simon Harris was the Minister for Health at the beginning, wasn't he? And then Stephen Donnelly after him. Leo Varadkar, Micheál Martin. So, like, it's just this difference of experience. They cannot understand why people who were horrendously impacted by this might, lash out on social media or in person if they see them in public. And it's like a lot of people have had a really, really tough time over the past 5 years in particular in this country. And if you're wondering why the tone of politics is falling or why politicians are becoming much less popular, you know, that's why. So yeah, and the thing is, Tony Holohan again is a bit of a lightning rod because of the COVID experience, but it's not like any of the alternatives coming forward, other than the sort of mystery Gareth Sheridan. It's not like any of the others coming forward are going to be substantially more popular because it's becoming the ways that these people are sort of just faces for a system that oppresses them in many ways. If I could sort of be so bold as to speak for the people who are disgruntled currently.
Absolutely. I suppose that dovetails nicely with the next topic that we were going to touch on today, which
Ju-
is the
just to
public.
infuriate people more.
Yeah, absolutely. The rage episode. The fact that, as both you have covered, Jason, and as I have covered as of last week, the government did a public consultation on their misinformation and disinformation strategy, where they effectively asked the public, "Hey guys, what do you think of this? Do you think that this would be a good idea to in fact, they didn't even ask that. They were just asking about its implementation. They said, what do you want to see in our disinformation strategy? They took it as a given. Oh, well, of course, this is going to be a thing, but we just want to know your thoughts. And the overwhelming majority, 83% of responses, were negative and told them to shove it up their ass effectively. And they acknowledged that in the subsequent report. They said, yeah, by the way, most of the responses were negative. Most of the responses expressed free speech concerns and said that the government has no right to regulate what is true and false. And they were basically saying that this doesn't need to happen at all. That was the general sentiment from the general public. This is according to the Department of Communications' own report. And they then proceeded to go ahead with the strategy anyway and totally ignore those people. And they did the same thing for the hate speech bill, as I previously covered. They did the same thing for the SBAG, I believe, which they ignored again. They did the same thing for the family and care referendums. A year before those referendums were held, they did a public consultation saying, what do you think of us having a gender equality referendum? 91% of people said, we don't want a referendum. The Constitution is fine as it is. Leave it alone. They went ahead with it anyway, spent 20 million of the public's money on a referendum that was then humiliatingly crushed and defeated. So the bottom line here that we all need to come to grips with is, I believe, twofold. And I do want to hear your take on this, but two things that I would really love to impress upon people watching this is public consultations are a scam. All of them. They're not real. They don't care what you have to say. The only reason they do it is as a box ticking exercise to create the illusion of assent, but they're just going to do whatever the hell they want to do regardless. And the only time they bring up the results is when the results are favorable to them. So if, they have an astroturfed one where a lot of NGOs say, yeah, we want you to do X, Y, and Z, and that one happens to be majority in their favor, then they'll say, look, we have a public consultation and most of the responses were supportive. If it's not supportive, they just ignore it and they continue regardless. But with that said, I would strongly encourage people to continue engaging with them anyway, despite it being useless and despite them not taking your thoughts into account, because it shows them up every time, in my view. Every time the
Yeah.
state does a consultation and the majority of responses are negative, and then they go ahead with it anyway, that just shows the anti-democratic streak that we have running through this state in undeniable terms. By the way, I'm not saying you should always give a negative response. Give your honest response. If you support something the government is doing, then feel free to say that. If you oppose it, feel free to say that too. Fill it out as you would. But all I'm saying is the public should continue to engage with this process so that when it is ignored, we can continue to point out the sham that it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people can't have victory now, they can at least take solace in the fact that they'll have contributed to a public record that'll deepen the infamy of the present government at a future time when better people than us decide they want to change direction. But yeah, it's outrageous, and yeah, you're not being dishonest with your use of the word scam because the public consultation, the document that this was all leading to was the National Counter Disinformation Strategy. And this is a document that is so illustrative of the way governance in modern Ireland works, where sort of, yeah, public consultations are either picked up if they're favorable or just ignored and discarded if they aren't. But also, in that sort of, again, the institutional backing they receive is in no way uh this was representative of the people or independent. Like, for example, I wrote an article about the disinformation strategy back when it came out, and it was lauded by Minister. Well, lauded is maybe a bit strong, but Minister Patrick O'Donovan, a week before it came out, had said in response to a parliamentary question that the department had provided the secretariat to the independently chaired working group that was established to develop a national counter disinformation strategy. It's like, we've all read 1984. We've all heard the phrase double think and things like this. That is prime double think. The department provided the secretariat to the independently chaired working group. It's like, what was the working group independent of? Certainly not the government if the secretariat was provided by the department. So you've got departmental influence, like, directly in there in terms of, choosing the direction for that working group. You had organizations invited to it. You had multiple departments invited to it. The Department of Tourism, I'm not going to say the whole name, but the Department of Media. You had Comisiún na Mán, which is a state-related body on Garda Síochána. You had in terms of NGOs and things like that, you had the Journal giving presentations on their fact-check unit. You had a Rethink Ireland funded Hope and Courage Collective, and again, Rethink Ireland is sort of the Ireland accelerator organization that provides funding to a whole load of NGOs and different helpful organizations, and I say that obviously with a smirk. So, like, everything about this is a stitch up, to put it that way. It's like there is no way in which it's independent from any sort of establishment that we have in Ireland. Pretty much everyone is involved. The government is involved. State agencies are involved. NGOs and favorable media organizations are involved. Then, yeah, the public gives its feedback and it's overwhelmingly negative, and they're like, yeah, okay, we'll just leave that part out and we'll sort of focus a little bit more on what the experts had to say, which was all very good and favorable, and that's why we have this, brand shiny new strategy that we do. And again, it's not like it's some inconsequential strategy. It's the National Counter Disinformation Strategy, where they're essentially setting out the national agenda for dealing with mis and disinformation, which it's not that long a document. I do encourage people to go read it, or if they don't have time for that, I went through it and wrote an article about it at the time. But the sort of big takeaway is that there's much more focus on it. Mis and disinformation is sort of attributed to coming from, malevolent international influences, like, Russia is the one they point to as ever, or other shadowy international organizations. Or if I remember correctly, there is sort of mention to the sort of disgruntled. Now again, I'm paraphrasing. They don't put it this way, but essentially, bad faith actors domestically trying to sort of sow disharmony and things like that. And it's like, wonder who that's supposed to be. So the whole thing is sort of rotten from top to bottom. And when you look at episodes like this, with the National Counter Disinformation Strategy and how it came about, the way the public opinion on it was discarded, you just look back to what we were talking about in relation to Tony Holohan and the way in which politics itself is darkening in Ireland. There's why it's like gravity. It's a natural phenomenon. If you don't listen to people, they'll get more vocal in a nasty way. And you can say that without condoning it, and you can also say without condoning it that the fringe extreme of that is that people get more violent. So it's completely avoidable, but it won't be avoided.
I think that's a really important point, that everybody wants to see people express their concerns in a reasonable, respectful, legitimate way. That's the goal of any good faith person. That's certainly my goal. That's certainly your goal. That's what we should all want to see for society. But when people engage with a public consultation process and they write letters to their local TD and they write letters to their local senator and they go to a protest and they vote, but all the political parties have pretty much the same policies, so their vote doesn't really have the intended effect, and so on
And
and so forth.
I would just add in another dynamic here is that, like, say, when it comes to the presidential election, there are some out there candidates, say, who've expressed their interest in running, like Nick Delahanty or Conor McGregor. Now, these are completely different people, but they're out there, by the establishment standards, candidates. But the parties could close ranks so as to shut them even being given an opportunity to run. That's just another way in which people perceive that the legitimate avenues aren't working.
Exactly. So you can't even vote for your preferred candidate because they're not even allowed to be on the ballot, let alone, give you a chance to vote them in. So when Peter Casey, to the best of my knowledge, has not managed to secure a nomination yet. He came second the last time. He ran so clearly, if anybody should be allowed to run, it's him, regardless of whether you would vote for him or you wouldn't vote for him, you like him, you dislike him. That's irrelevant. This guy clearly struck some kind of chord with the electorate at the very last election, and he's struggling to get on the ballot. What the hell is that about? So the point here is, if you eliminate all of the legitimate, peaceful, reasonable ways that people want to express their views, then what is left but unreasonable ways, which is not what anyone wants to see, and it's not what anybody should encourage, and it's certainly not what I'm encouraging, but it is an unfortunate reality that that's where this sort of thing leads. And I would also say, you have to really look at the level of chicanery that we're dealing with. Like, you'd struggle to find something like this outside of a used car dealership when Helen McEntee was the justice minister, and her actual defense of ignoring the public consultation on hate speech was, she said, well, look, we did 5 strands and 4 of the strands were overwhelmingly positive and only 1 of them was negative. So really, what are you complaining about? What she doesn't tell you there is that the 1 strand that was negative was the general public, thousands and thousands of responses from the general public. And the 4 that were positive were like a handful of NGOs that were all state funded, a handful of academics, like people who are working at, some government funded anti-disinformation academic project kind of thing, etc., etc. So to make an analogy, this would be like if we did a consultation on whether or not Ben Scallon is the coolest guy in Ireland. And as part of this, I do 5 strands. I ask my colleagues at work, my close relatives, my extended family, and my friends. And then, as the last one, I open it up to everyone else in the country. And if everyone else in the country said, no, Ben Scallon's a loser, we hate him, and all of my mates and family members say, no, Ben Scallon is class, then I say, well, look, it's 4 out of 5, isn't it? So clearly, I can take the crown as the coolest man in Ireland. It's that stupid and absurd, but that's actually the stunt they tried to pull in terms of pulling the wool over people's eyes. It's literally shameless.
If the unanimous opinion of your family and friends and everything was all positive, you would be doing remarkably well then.
That's true, yeah. There's no guarantee I would win that, even given the nature of it, but go on.
They'd be like, yeah, 0 of the strands came back positive. Plow ahead with painting Ben's face onto the side of buses anyway. But no, it's absurd stuff, and it is being reflected. And it's something that really annoys me. The people will come back and say that if you even notice or acknowledge these trends, you're contributing to it. You're normalizing or legitimizing, say, hate speech or political violence or any of these things. And it's like, no, you're literally just observing the world. That's all that's happening there. It is the case, and it's the case throughout history, that when people feel like authority, and this is the really dangerous one. I'm sure that the number one reason, I'm not saying this is going to happen in Ireland, but I'm just saying it's always a bad trend for revolutions or for sort of violent upheaval, is because of the delegitimization of authority. And what significantly contributes to the delegitimization of authority is when the authorities just do not listen over and over and over again, and times keep getting harder for the people as a result. And that's sort of the dynamic. Again, now, it's a funny one. I don't think
that's going to lead to any sort of revolution in the Western world, because it's that Substack writer Connor Fitzgerald, sort of presciently is the wrong word, but he insightfully pointed out there's going to be no civil wars in the West because everyone's too fat. I kind of I wouldn't say too fat, although there is obviously a lot of obesity out there. It's more so the case that everyone's kind of anesthetized. I think, like, you can be really annoyed about something and then you go and watch Netflix in the evening and you just won't be that annoyed anymore. Whereas you're just pacing around your darkened house in the evening, you're obviously going to hold on to that flame a little more grudgingly as time goes on. So
yeah, like, sorry to interrupt you, but like, I'm not clearly, I don't think it needs to be said that I'm not endorsing Stalin here. But, Stalin was obviously a communist revolutionary. He was an evil scumbag. But I remember, I could be misremembering this, but I'm pretty sure I heard that he used to, for a while, sleep under his coat on couches when he was a revolutionary because he needed to be able to just go. Like, he would sleep fully dressed because he didn't know if somebody was going to break in to try and apprehend him or whatever, and that he was constantly on his guard, basically, and that for years, he wouldn't like get comfy in his pajamas or whatever because he was constantly on the move and so on. And the only reason I bring that up is to say, like, those sorts of revolutionary movements throughout history were hard, or even Irish rebels, again, like,
yeah,
these were hard men. Like, you don't really see that strain in Western, like, you hear about Americans talking about forming militias and stuff, and, like, no offense to any Americans watching this, like, I know some stereotypes are unfair and not reflective of the whole country, but when I think of the American youth, I don't exactly think of grizzled, hardened revolutionaries, you know what I
yeah.
mean? Like, I
But
think about overweight people with pink hair who are addicted to their phone and who have 14 hours screen time per day.
it's literally exactly that. It's like, as well, because I would say X certainly has become a lot more right wing, certainly since Elon bought the thing. And a lot of that comes down to, like, the really discontent people are spending a ton of time on X and they're just posting and posting and posting. And, like, yes, it's changing the tone of the conversation, but it's not really contributing to all that much change on the ground. When you look at stats, when you look at, I suppose, yeah, the experience on the ground, to put it that way, it's really just a sort of venting void that a lot of people, because they spend their entire experience is dictated by their engagement with that platform, they assume it's reflective of reality, and in my estimation, it really isn't. So it is all just to say that there's certainly, I would say, at the level of rhetoric, a delegitimization of authority going on, and you even see this in much more traditional ways, like plummeting popular support for, like, the main parties in Ireland, like Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin. Uh, 2 decades ago, I didn't look before this. I mean, they would have been up over 40% in opinion polls and things like that. Whereas now, the three of them are constantly sort of bouncing up and down between each other to be at roughly 20%. Like, it's the popular support for these organizations has plummeted in recent years. So you can't even say amongst the people who are voting for them that the people governing the country are popular, and certainly amongst the growing number of people who aren't voting for them, they're increasingly unpopular. So certainly that sort of delegitimization is taking place, but whether anything comes of that, I'm personally skeptical because of, yeah, those trends, as I say, that Connor Fitzgerald pointed to. It's kind of like an excessive love of comfort, or buy into anesthetization through entertainment and through different things that's taken place. So suffice it to say, it doesn't make for very edifying conversation in the political sphere.
And please God, we never see anything like that in our lifetime or ever. And that, there is never any kind of upsurge in that sort of sentiment. Like, we hope that the social safety valves are returned so that people can express themselves in a reasonable, respectful, calm way. With that said, we're going to move on to a topic that you were reporting on just today. I'm wondering if you want to kick us off with that, our last subject in relation to eugenics.
Yeah, I do. So speaking of the ways in which, like, the tone of conversation is, in my estimation, declining in many ways, there was something that took place over the weekend that I thought was just interesting and worth discussing, because we, as I say, we sometimes like to include a cultural thing on this. And for better or worse, the New York Times is a very remains an influential publication in the Western world, and indeed in Ireland. So one of their leading columnists, Ross Douthat, he has a podcast now, and he had on his podcast this woman, Noor Siddiqui, I believe it's pronounced, who is with this organization called Orchid Inc., which is on its own profile, it's described as the world's first whole genome embryo screen. So he had her on, and she was essentially, making the pitch that like the next embryos, the next parenting trend starts before conception, as a I think it was the podcast put it that way. And she has this company that is advocating for embryo screening. So like you're able to like have a look at your child's genome and make the decision, which genome to go with, which embryo, sorry, to go with on the basis of that. She put up a post, and this kind of sums up. This is her sort of elevator pitch, to put it that way. She put up a post after the podcast in which she said, "What if your baby never walks? What if they're never able to live independently? What if you could have stopped it but chose not to? That's the question Orchid Inc.'s embryo screening forces. You optimize everything, career, diet, skincare, but you're going to chance it on your child's genome, one of the most significant determinants of their health." So she made her appearance on this really influential podcast, and she got, at least in the circles I move in on social media, pretty significant backlash. But I'm not sure my circles are entirely representative of popular opinion, because I'm obviously Catholic and have a lot of Catholic presence on there, and that would be entirely contrary to sort of, Christian viewpoint on human dignity and things like that. And I was very surprised when I moved sort of outside of those Christian circles, amongst people who, over the past decade and a half, certainly, I'm putting it at that because that's sort of the time that I've been politically conscious, people who were considered allies by many sort of conservatives and those on the right, just to use these loose terms, in the fight against the woke left, very much didn't really see any sort of problems with Miss Siddiqui's proposition, or this new sort of trend towards embryo screening and sort of optimizing your child before they're born, and you do that by sort of eliminating undesirable embryos and keeping those that you want. Like you had and a lot of people might say, "Oh, this moron," as soon as I mention his name, but that American Richard Hanania, who was clearly picking up the conversation, and he said Down syndrome is the one disease where the relatives of the people with the disease go around advocating more people have it. It's a uniquely sick thing. Another one was Claire Lemon, who is I think she's either the editor or the managing editor of Quillette, that Australian publication. And she was essentially saying that, like, in response to sort of all the Christian outrage about it, she was saying, "I respect the Christian ethic that all life is sacred, but I do not respect this preening moral superiority about the extremely difficult prospect of bringing children into the world with fatal or debilitating genetic diseases." She was kind of the opinion that, like, if childbirth, if having children becomes a more sort of scientifically or technically dictated process, we're not really losing anything, because she was making the case that the past, and she's right in this, the past in many ways wasn't kind to disabled children. And she was saying that, like, historically disabled kids have been, I think she said, hidden, institutionalized, and erased. But, like, it seems like she was sort of expressing that an openness to the idea of embryo screening, which is essentially, in my estimation, just nipping the problem in the bud, to put it that way, which is getting rid of the disabled kids before they're born. Because I would be of the opinion, and I would be of the opinion that science is in agreement with me on this, that the child already exists. They're at a very early stage of their development, but they already exist. And so by sort of, selecting against that embryo, it's not like you've sort of, magic the child away. It's like, well, you've kind of, terminated, selected against that one.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. I thought you were done.
No,
go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. I was just going to say that it seems to me, just to crystallize what I'm talking about here, because I'm ranting a little bit, that there is the resurgence of a eugenic mindset, and that it's not something that's limited to the left. I think a lot of people whose, whether they realize it or not, main driver in life is just to avoid suffering. Something like this doesn't seem like an unpalatable prospect. In fact, quite the opposite. It seems like the obvious thing for loving and caring parents to do. And that those who might continue a pregnancy with, say, a child that has Down syndrome, to use the example, are being irresponsible and ultimately, not as loving as they could have been. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this trend that I think I'm observing.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously significant overlap between this and the abortion debate as to when does human life begin, because a lot of people
Mm.
have this view that the embryo or a zygote effectively, it's not really a human person, so it doesn't matter what you do to it and blah blah blah, because it doesn't look anything like a person. It's just, and I mean, there's the instinctive knee-jerk argument in response to that if God forbid somebody goes through the pain of miscarriage, even at an early gestational stage, you would never say to that person, sure, what are you crying about, you only lost a clump of cells. Like, I think anybody who's gone through that, and God bless them, I hope I never have to experience that, knows that a profound loss has taken place, because when push comes to shove, we all instinctively understand that this was a human life that's been lost. But on a more on a less emotional level, I suppose, more objective level, science tells us, I defy anybody watching this who doubts what I'm about to say. You look it up. Don't take my word for it. Go onto Google and look up, when does human life begin? And you will find in any medical textbook, any kind of scientific literature on this, that human life objectively begins at conception in the womb. Because that is when, as we all know, a sperm and an egg meet. And at that precise moment, that individual cell has its own unique eye color, its own unique hair color, its own skin tone. Every single thing about that person is now contained within that cell, and they are distinct from both the mother and the father. They're just very, very small. They're at an earlier stage of development than an older person. And they will continue to develop along that continuum into whatever they're going to be. So the only reason I bring that up is to say, not according to me, or not according to Jason, according to science, if human life begins at conception, then saying, oh, well, we can see there's a genetic flaw, so-called, in this embryo, so we're just going to kill it now and abort that process or stop that in its tracks, you are ending the life of a human person. That's a scientific, I suppose if you wanted to be really charitable, you could say then we have to get into a conversation about what's a person. Is everybody who's biologically human a person? But then I don't think that's a conversation that society really wants to have. Then you're getting into very potentially dangerous territory when you start having those conversations. So, yeah,
I was gonna,
sorry,
I was
guys.
just gonna say it all gets into, because like the dangerous territory is unavoidable in the sense that like a lot of these conversations are taking place, like they're well underway and they're growing, which is why I figured it was worth discussing, and why I figured it's something that'll become more prominent in the future. Because while this was the latest incident that made all that sort of blew the topic up, there was another one just when was it, 3 months ago or so. I wrote an article about this other company called Nucleus Embryo that a lot of people were reacting very poorly to. Um, and what they were saying, yeah, like their elevator pitch for their product was that every parent wants to give their children more than they had. For the first time in human history, Nucleus adds a new tool to that commitment. And that was Nucleus Embryo, where you were able to sort of compare this is for parents going through IVF and things like that. You were able to see the genetic profile of each of the embryos and sort of choose and compare which one you might want. And the reason I think it's interesting to discuss again is because it just seemed to be based on very faulty thinking about the human person and what gives life meaning and things like that. Because the founder and CEO of Nucleus, Keen Sadeghi, I believe his name was, said that he was sort of giving his emotional background for why he thought this was a worthwhile product. And he said that I'm quoting him here. I pulled it up. He said, "My parents are immigrants from Iran who came to America with nothing but a conviction that me and my siblings would have more. But when my 15-year-old cousin suddenly died in her sleep from a preventable genetic disease, my family was powerless to save her." And this is continuing the quote. "My parents, grieving the loss of my cousin, were also terrified. What if my siblings and I were at the same risk? That was the first time I understood what generational health meant. Our users don't just do nucleus for themselves, they do it for themselves and their loved ones. Now I'm proud to say that care can start before a child is even born." So my reading of that, he brought in this emotional thing about his 15-year-old cousin who died from a preventable genetic disease. I said, like, are we to take from this that it would have been better if his 15-year-old cousin had been screened out at the beginning in favor of a more perfect specimen who didn't die in their sleep? Like, it's an extremely anti-human philosophy because, like, whether people like it or not, humans come in all shapes and sizes. They come in every kind of form, healthier and unhealthier. I would be coming from a place that, all of those people deserve to be welcomed and cared for. And I know we don't live in a perfect world, and very often, like poor Harvey Schraff, who, as we've seen, who came into the world very, very sick and suffered much of his life because of it. He was denied the help that he needed, and that happens far too often. But these lives have meaning and they're incredibly valuable. And it seems like the modern solution to these things is just like, figure it out beforehand and, cut it off, discard that embryo. And it just strikes me as being, extremely anti-human and being, to use the word eugenic. And I think that there's a problem that a growing number of people don't seem to have a problem with that. Again, if your base motivation is avoid suffering at all costs, then I can see how you would support something like this. But I think people ought to be aware that if that's your base motivation, it could lead to pretty horrendous things. There's a load of things you could justify in the name of avoiding suffering at all costs, it seems to me.
Yeah, I know this is not unique to the left. I know that the right, some elements on the so-called right, also endorse these ideas, unfortunately.
Historically, very much so.
Yeah. So, but I will say something that bothers me is I wish the left were what they said they are. Like, this is a realization I've been having more and more, where I've been like, your knee-jerk reaction when you're arguing with somebody is to just oppose what they're saying and kind of like push back on it or think, how do I rebut that? Or, you know what I mean? I think that's like a natural human instinct. But I was thinking about different things that they discuss. And if you take away your preconceived biases or what you know already to be true, if you just take some of these views at face value, you can agree with the general idea in the sense that, like, take the idea of privilege, like we hear about, like, white privilege or male privilege or whatever, which you and I are totally opposed to and which I remain opposed to. I think it's total nonsense and discriminatory, offensive nonsense. But the general idea that if you are in a better position than somebody else, you should use that position to help those people. You should take care of those who are less financially well off than you. You should make an extra effort. If you're a man, for example, and you see a woman being attacked, you should intervene, or if she's being harassed or something. This sort of thing. That's a Christian ethic that I can totally get behind. And so can you, and so can most people watching this. That actual idea isn't wrong. They just implement it in such a horrible, hypocritical way that they bastardize it and they make it to something that you can in no way support. And similarly, their whole thing about inclusion and helping vulnerable minorities and so on, that's something I can totally agree with, if that's what they meant. And if what they meant by that was taking care of people who have genetic malformities or problems or whatever, we can absolutely have that meme with the predator meme,
the clap hand,
the handshake. I could totally agree with them on that and get behind, but then they're so inconsistent that you just can't support it. But I wish they would live up to these values, many of which are actually good. They just don't, consistently abide by them.
No, that's the great problem of hypocrisy, I suppose, that, at the same time, they're also, in theory against big business and oligarchy and things like this. And at the same time, their causes are championed by all of the businesses in the world. And then, like, I always just think it's the most stunning
failure of the left in Ireland, and it's not the most, because I'm sort of personally opposed to, abortion as much as anything you can be politically. But I would say that it's one of the most stunning failures of the left in Ireland that they have not had a word to say about the Wild West iPass situation. It's like there are clearly lots of people profiting on a situation that's really, really bad for both the marginalized in Ireland, to use the language, and also the people who are coming to Ireland in the iPad and entering into the asylum system and things like this, because the thing has just become a mess, and there hasn't been a peep out of the left on that front, because they sort of bought into this warped value system of the worldview where they're unable to speak out against these things because they sort of feel like that's giving fuel to the far right's fire and things like that. So it's a complete I mean, people have long pointing out sort of the godless left has created a lot of its own problems. So I it's just a point on that. I think that you and I would probably both be in agreement that it's the godless part of that is the main problem. But I'd say that we trace all of our issues back to that ultimately.
Absolutely. The locus of all of society's downfalls and disasters.
Whether people like to hear it or not, yeah.
With that said, thank you all so much for watching. As always, we will see you next week, and we look forward to the next episode. I hope you do too. God bless.
God bless.